The road to hell is paved by Argent Energy.
It's hard to shake the feeling that Doom 2016 looks like one of only 2 new id Games I've played in over a decade. The company hasn't been real productive over the past 10 years in terms of making totally new original stuff up from scratch. 2011's Rage wasn't a remake, but it got tepid reviews and then preceded the departure of John Carmack and the cancellation of a very, very different Doom 4 that got caught in development hell. But now Bethesda is shaking id Software awake. They're putting their new Swedish studio to work and utilizing all those id properties they acquired about 6 to 7 years ago. The new Wolfenstein spin-off series and now Doom 2016 have revitalized the blandest, brownest, and first FPS franchises into something a little more premium. Apparently, people are getting excited about a game called Quake Champions. Arena shooters are coming back, and if old id franchises are also coming back to be the most badass arena shooters of the bunch, I'd actually be pretty happy. Low expectations got turned around once again with Doom, which is probably not a masterpiece of the art form, but at least a step in the right direction. The game's been out for a month, a lot of general reviews already exist to sum it up, so I want to narrow my focus on just 2 topics that really got me interested while playing, and they are just how many brilliant and clever strides they've taken to make balls-to-the-wall mid-90s FPS hyperviolence work in 2016, and just how far down it's dragged by time spent backtracking through an empty map, weighing the consequences of different progression goals, and reading flavor text. In other words, the action and the inaction. Doom 3 in 2004 was an attempt to capitalize on the horrifying and immersive qualities of the original games, and the lesson they learned is that those qualities kind of became obsolete. Even at the time, Half-Life and System Shock 2 did the same shtick better. Doom in 2016, on the other hand, is an attempt to capitalize on the gameplay of the original game, the qualities that have aged far better. What countless editorials and videos have been recently arguing is that it's the power trip, not the nightmare, that remains so appealing about the original Dooms. So Doom 2016 has you circle strafing and bounce padding around enemies at a base walking speed comparable to some of the vehicles of other games. It's still a shock to just look at this footage and know that this is a AAA game in 2016. They actually went and did it! And with their AAA resources came enough of a budget for polish that its modern interpretation of vintage gameplay outshines other games that have tried the same thing. The classic problem with the modern nostalgic FPS is that rendering a level packed shoulder to shoulder full of bad guys is a hell of a lot more demanding when they're made out of polygons rather than sprites. A solution, as seen in Serious Sam, Painkiller, and even the modern Shadow Warrior, is to have smaller waves of enemies continuously spawn in while you're kind of locked in a room until those waves are done. And for whatever my opinion's worth, I've never liked that. It eliminates the elements of preparation, light tactics, and resource management that the old Doom clones had. So the new Doom solution is to make resource management part of the combat. The gameplay designers must really like Platinum action games. The Rune Trials are straight up Alfheims from Bayonetta, but the real game changer is Doom's version of the stab and grab from Metal Gear Rising. Weakened enemies slow down and turn blue and become health fountains, just like in Revengeance, whose fast, intense combat had your fingers all aflutter except during periodic breaks in the middle of the action. Breaks that, like in Doom, act as your resource management and also gave the combat a good sense of pacing. The combat has peaks and valleys of tension like a good story or song, constant beats and changes to keep the audience engaged. What I want to illustrate here are these regular pulses of high-energy inputs that tend to come between 2-second pauses, which are either going to be straight uninterrupted movement or the glory kills, which refill health. And that's a smart middle ground between the finite health refills of the old games and the regenerating health of new games. Though Doom 2016 doesn't technically have regenerating health, your health will be refilling during a fight, probably even faster than in your average Call of Duty clone. You just gotta press a button every now and then to make it happen. And the mechanic of enemies dropping more health when you're at low health means that the optimal strategy for a quick refill is to kill lots of demons really fast while close to death, which is an elegant way to ensure that high-risk play yields high rewards. But there's also something to be said of your ammo pool, which is similarly lower than in the olden games, but also refillable in the middle of combat. So that had me regularly exhausting almost my whole arsenal, refilling it again with a chainsaw, then cycling through it all again. It's a slick way to get players to experiment and discover what weapon combos work with what enemies and what don't. which are strategies required by their AI and formations, especially at higher difficulties. These monsters with the shields were easy peasy until I cranked it up to Nightmare mode, where they suddenly got hard until learning their new weakness, which was splash damage coming at them from behind. And that was super cool. Having to learn that was fun. Seeing giant blue blobs spray out at smushed bad guys is fun. Any single one of the fights in this game is a grand old time. It's an inspired mix of the power trip of Doom with the pacing and systems mastery of character action games with some of the most shamelessly cathartic aesthetics ever. This time, it knows what's still appealing about Doom, and for so much of this game, they've cranked that appeal up to 11. But then there's the rest of it, the stuff you do outside of combat. 2 years ago, I made an entire video about the kind of upgrade system Doom ended up having. For as much strides as AAA games have made in the past 2 years in terms of their breadth of depth and steering away from all that railroading, we're still having our hero do blank X amount of times to make one of their mechanical pieces of equipment perform better. It's a nonsensical process, just like filling out Doom Marine's little flavor text website, but I'm totally willing to suspend my disbelief for Doom of all things. They call these combat challenges, but they're really combat quotas. And they limit what are great combat encounters by nudging players into playstyles that aren't really optimal or oftentimes even fun. Sometimes they're incredibly situational. Kill a revenant in mid-air, okay, but they stop jumping in the air at low health and I'm not going to get that chance often, and I have a strict time limit. I gotta do that by the end of one level. So what I did was retried this fight in particular about 4 times before finally checking that one off the list and moving on. I was just willingly getting myself killed if I didn't do it right. Note, this has a lot to do with my playstyle. I'm a huge stickler for filling out checklists and will generally do them even if I hate doing them. I always want to exhaust as much content out of a game during the first playthrough, and whether that's a product of me playing them for review purposes or just trying to be thorough, I think my preoccupation with checklists genuinely hurt my enjoyment of this game. But one thing that definitely contributed though is just how much pull there is to fill out these checklists, because you're rewarded with weapon upgrades. Finding secrets, finding bobbleheads, finding enemies, doing blank X amount of times, all make your weapons perform better, which is a substantial long-term goal. These aren't optionals you can easily ignore. In the classic Doom games, you could end up spending a whole lot of time hunting for secrets, but you were always rewarded with just health, ammo, and maybe a power-up or weapon if you were lucky. They were very short-term rewards because there was no long-term progression system. It was more about the accomplishment of finding the secret, not the tokens it gave you. Plus, they weren't clearly marked on your map, blatantly telling you where they were and teasing you to come find them. So in the new Doom, I found myself wandering around empty levels for like 20-30 minutes at a time, combing for stuff I missed, because I'm the Doom Marine. I run at like 30 miles an hour. I don't need to stop and smell the roses. But with so many roses so clearly marked on the map and them being so important for your progression, it feels like a genuine failure to miss just one. I had a suspicion during my first playthrough that if I started again and just ignored all that stuff, it would be way more fun. I wanted to just focus on the combat, minimize all that downtime, and rip and tear my way through. So after finishing the final boss, I started again. I cranked up the difficulty to Nightmare and let her rip, and found myself dealing with the same problem, wandering empty levels for much longer than I wanted to. The irony is that it was made almost worse by the higher difficulty. With the stakes higher, I really wanted those upgrades even more. The idea is a novel one. It openly shares what was cool about finding secrets in the old game, but the weapon upgrade point tied to it feels like they're enforcing you to agree with them about how cool the secrets were in the old games. Plus, the whole system really stretches the definition of the word secret. My proposed solution here is to telegraph them far less for far less of a reward, make them something special for returning players rather than something so important for first-timers. Or just have a proper New Game Plus mode where I can crank up the difficulty and keep all my upgrades. That'd fix it too. At least during the second playthrough, I didn't have to read all this flavor text, which is my second big gripe here. There's a lot of flavor text. Most of it's not great. The sections about the artifacts are fun to read, and the rest is full of too many long-winded pseudoscience explaining stuff I never really questioned because this is Doom! Suspension of disbelief comes with the title, and the writers knew that. The game starts with a lot of humor and personality, and there's not much of that to be found in most of these entries. I want to rip and tear! I don't want to rip and read, but you're constantly asked to stop stop what you're doing and tab out and read about Argent Energy, Argent Energy, Argent Energy. Come to think of it, Bayonetta had a pretty similar codex of its own, and Metal Gear Rising had those really long codec conversations, but those games didn't slap HUD notifications asking you to stop the action to learn the lore. It felt like something special for returning players, which is really kind of the rock and the hard place that making this stuff lands the developers in. Sure, they went to the effort to put it there, and sure, I could just ignore it, but I won't, because of this notification right here. The game's telling me to press tab, there's no negative consequences for doing it, I might read something funny, so I'll press tab. Every time, and usually it's not funny. Which is really why I think this is such a big problem with what is a pretty good game. The action is great, the combat is fantastic, and the levels are intricately suited for it, and I'm sure they'd make for some fun secret hunting if the game was just less transparent about how much there is to find, and maybe if it instructed you less about how to get there, or how to play it, or how to interpret it. There are too many prompts pulling you away from the game's best content towards its worst. That's the problem. This feels like the most pure and ferocious version of Doom that the AAA industry could have possibly churned out. There's a real freeform and liberating combat system to it, fueled by music, animations, and aesthetics designed above all else to get you pumped. Any player running through this game is going to be a ravenous, primal beast screaming to be free. But we have all these shackles trying to restrain them. My advice, ignore them completely. Crank the difficulty up, crank the volume up, ignore the upgrades, ignore the flavor text. Disobey, rip and tear.